Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
When he put it forward, and, this was, of course, the same president who was making sort of racial slurs about this virus and amping up hatred against Asian Americans and Asians around the world. I think the most responsible people did not want to be seen to be feeding into some sort of unwarranted claims that were going to have a very toxic result in the real world. But what happened was, once he left office, the questions remained. There has been no animal host or intermediate animal found for this virus, despite an intensive search and something like 80,000 animals, wildlife samples tested. So given that, these questions began to come back. And they really came roaring back after the World Health Organization, the report that they participated in, which was credulous, essentially, which did not really challenge an underlying narrative that it was zoonotic, and didn't do anything close to the kind of forensic, accounting of the lab leak question. There's no lab data, there's no records, there's no lab notebooks, there's no access, essentially, to underlying records. So given that, how is it that you get to discard one hypothesis in favor of the other? So, with that report pretty much being chalked up to a failure, the question became, well, what are we going to do? How is the world going to ever figure this out?
The defense that we see from WHO is, where do we have the power to do any real investigation? How can you blame us? We depend entirely on the other countries' goodwill and support. So why blame us as an institution?
Well, yes, that's right. The World Health Organization is in a tough spot. It doesn't really have any authority. But I think that the head of the WHO, Tedros, opened the door when he said, for us, for the World Health Organization, all hypotheses remain on the table. In other words, we're looking at this report and we understand its shortcomings. Therefore, all hypotheses remain on the table. I think the question that a lot of people I interviewed asked is, how is it that you take one possibility off the table before you've investigated it?
You have looked at this very complex web of conflicts of interest. Mm-hmm. And you've simplified this in your article. Will you super simplify it now in 2 minutes?
Sure. So the US government is obviously a big funder of science. And after the SARS outbreak of 2002, they became big funders of virology research that aimed to sort of map the bat coronaviruses and kind of explore the risks of crossover or spillover to humans. Some of the research that they funded is called gain-of-function research. So it's somewhat risky research that basically aims to gauge the infectiousness of certain pathogens by altering them and trying to make them more infectious. Some of that funding went through an intermediary to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. That institute was doing this risky gain-of-function research at sort of low levels of lab security, about 7 miles away from the epicenter of the outbreak, which was this Wuhan seafood market, or believed initially to be the epicenter of the outbreak. So, people are asking what some investigators in the US government found when they started looking into these connections is that there was a reluctance among sort of the bureaucratic establishment to really delve into all of these connections. They felt that they were being told to stop digging or they would open a can of worms.
This is more American politics, but doesn't it also tell us that Trump administration, for all its boasts, and Pompeo did not quite have a hold on what was going on in the State Department?
Well, I think that's right. I mean, people made the point to me that despite all of Donald Trump's huffing and puffing about China and, being tough on China and using slurs which I don't want to repeat, to describe this virus, they actually were not really coordinating a comprehensive investigation, nor were they successful at negotiating tough terms at the World Health Assembly over what was going to be looked at and how it was going to be looked at.
The key issue here is that if National Institute of Health, for example, wanted this research done, why did they have to use a cutout in EcoHealth Alliance? Why not just give these grants directly?
Well, that's a really good question, and I'm not sure I know the answer to that, except that EcoHealth Alliance had a model that it was able to very successfully market to the National Institutes of Health to say, post-SARS outbreak, we're going to work with these global laboratories. We're going to dispatch people into the remote areas and collect these bat samples and bring them back and analyze them. Now, I had people who say to me, that's insanity, right? If you are bringing potentially dangerous infectious samples from remotest areas where maybe they should be left untouched, back into these crowded urban areas, into labs that have, a problematic safety regulations, so you can debate the science.
The line, if I remember from your article, although I've read so much now on this, I think it's from your article, that what they was doing, searching for these infectious viruses by bringing them from the wild into crowded cities, was like searching for a gas leak with a lit match.
Yes, that's right. That is what one critic of it described it as, and Peter Daszak, who heads EcoHealth Alliance, was pushing an effort called the Global Virome Project to dramatically expand that effort, which, as one critic said, it would be like looking for a gas leak with a blowtorch.
Not even a big match, a blowtorch, yes.
So, there is a lot of debate about the merits of this kind of work.
Have you thought sometimes, are you also inclined to believe that it's possible that this blowtorch lit a fire in Wuhan? There was a gas leak and the blowtorch got it.
I don't think that at the moment anything that is in the public domain is going to answer that question. How are we going to get closer to an answer? We may be able to get closer to an answer through intelligence findings of different governments. Maybe if China would cooperate, which it's stated clearly it is not inclined to do, if it was going to open up the laboratory to a kind of forensic scrutiny. The laboratory has this comprehensive database of coronavirus sequences, bat sequences, and it's been taken offline. And now nobody can have access to it.
I'll now take a couple of questions from Sandhya Ramesh, who's our science editor. So the first question she wants to ask is, what were some of the biggest roadblocks you faced when working on the Vanity Fair story? Which part proved to be the most challenging? That's a journalist's question. Fair.
That's a really good question. I mean, the reporting was incredibly challenging, and I likened it to an Escher drawing where, you go up a staircase and you think you've come to the end, and then it turns again and you go back down the other side. So, it has this strange sort of funhouse effect where it is very hard to get down to the ground level of what questions matter and why they matter. And furthermore, kind of, you have an army of international sleuths now looking into this, and they're turning up all kinds of things. Some of them matter and some of them don't. So, for example, one of the things that matters was turned up by an ex-science teacher who lives in Eastern India. He's known on Twitter as The Seeker. And he started researching in this Chinese database of dissertations. He doesn't speak any Mandarin, so he would put keywords into this database, and he would get a return of various academic papers written in China. He would put those through Google Translate, and by doing that, he came up with this master's thesis that was written in 2013 that opened, talk about a can of worms.
Except for a few in the letter in Science, how come so few virologists have come out to question the zoonotic transmission story? It's other scientists. And second, a linked question is that this sort of sensational, her word, not mine, sensational reporting around this possibility of a lab leak, even if warranted, isn't it now discouraging research in zoonosis?
So, first of all, I mean, this debate has become so heated in every direction. And I think a lot of virologists look at this landscape, which is full of, Twitter threats and funding threats and think they don't want to get involved, which is understandable. Also, a lot of them get their funding. Some of them are funded through China. Some of them are funded through the National Institutes of Health. And they look at this and they wonder, like, what is the upside here of jumping into this? That said, there are scientists who have actually changed their view in both directions. So there was a group of scientists early on who said anybody who talks about a possible lab origin is trafficking and conspiracy theories. That silenced everybody for a while. Most recently, there's a group of scientists who came out and said we would need to look seriously at a possible lab origin. So, scientists are beginning to sort of change their views, some of them in both directions. I think there is tremendous peer pressure, and there are also conflicts of interest. And I think this was seen most clearly with Peter Daszak of EcoHealth Alliance, who was behind the scenes orchestrated this letter in Lancet early on in the pandemic to say, anybody considering a lab leak hypothesis is trafficking in conspiracy theories. But behind the scenes, he was organizing this letter and trying to remove his fingerprints from it, essentially. And we know that because subsequent emails came out through a Freedom of Information group that was able to get those emails. So, there are definitely virologists whose self-interest is in a zoonotic origin. That doesn't mean that a zoonotic origin is wrong. Right. It doesn't mean that the lab leak is right, but it means that there are hidden interests that are have prevented a full assessment of the origin. There's sort of concern in both directions. There's concern that that a restriction on gain of function research is really restricting sort of essentials of virology. How are you going to develop vaccines? How are you going to anticipate threats unless you can do this kind of cutting edge research? Conversely, there are people who say, well, the virologists stepped in to cut off a full inquiry into this because it would do to the field of virology. If it was proved to be a lab leak, it would do to the field of virology what Chernobyl did to the field of nuclear science.
Yeah, or
You
Three
know.
Mile Island.
Or 3 Mile Island, right?
Yes. You mentioned that initial indications came out from some Chinese social media users. So what
Right.
were those precise indications? Then we know that those were quickly snuffed out.
Right. So, I was able to sort of recreate the U.S. government investigation into the question of origin. So there was a group in what's called the National Security Council, which is the sort of security council that advises the president. They were looking at this landscape, and it's not that there were, were there hawks inside of the Trump administration saying this is a lab leak? Yes. But the people who were really saying it was a lab leak were the Chinese, were the social media users, also Chinese scientists. So there was a paper early on by 2 Chinese scientists in Wuhan who said, where did this virus come from? Well, we've canvassed the area of Wuhan and we found these 2 labs doing coronavirus research. And they basically laid out this early picture, and the paper was removed from the internet. But, the U.S. government took note of that.